We're going to move on now to hear from Cristina Grasseni, and she is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, and she's going to speak with us about skilled visions, ecologies of belonging, and sensorial apprenticeship.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here, so thank you for the invitation. I'm going to contribute another qualitative approach here, not one based on artistic experience, but on ethnographic experience. So another kind of personal, even subjective engagement with real-life activities in real-life settings, but from a point of view of participant observation. I'm going to be talking about visual skill. And my first general point about visual skill is that most times it's actually invisible. Visual competence is embodied, it's sensorial, it's tacit, it's a result of inculcation, training, and acculturation. It's not necessarily visible per se. For example, a good general practitioner does not wear his semiotic eye like a pair of glasses for everyone to see. And that's why it's difficult to tell a good doctor at first sight. She, the doctor, is actually the one that should tell at first sight, or rather through a combination of sight, touch, hearing, smell, and heuristic questioning, what's the matter with me? To give another example, more modern and technologically advanced, reading a CT scan is not a straightforward matter. It's a matter of enskillment, to use the expression of anthropologist Tim Ingold. With proper training, a doctor will indeed read a CT scan at first sight. And a good doctor will be able to articulate relevant information to a layperson about it, for instance, directing the eyesight of the layperson to the relevant features of the graphic device. I have a vivid recollection of how a charitable liver surgeon held up to me an MRI and followed with his fingertip the contour of the cancer, showing how it had invaded most of the liver, and what's worse, how it adhered to the walls of the organ, thus making him presume that metastases had already spread beyond those walls. So the clarity of that information conveyed to me was blinding. This man, the man whose MRI I was looking, would die. And it was evident, but only to trained eyes. Which leads me to my second point about visual skill. The skills needed to competently interpret a number of visual arrangements are not acquired spontaneously. Visual skills are learned within specific cultures and communities of practice. The example of the surgeon gives us a little insight into how an apprenticeship of the eye may begin. I had just received the relevant training to accept one single fact as evident, but not enough training to dispute it or to recognize a similar one. Novices, in fact, follow the authority to know what to look out for. So specific ways of mastering professional and relational domains through distinct visual skills are different in different places for different people who do different things, and it was different in different periods of time. Just to give a simple example, let's think of millennials, or rather pre-millennials like me, and the difference it makes to be socialized practically from birth into screen-based or touchscreen-based networked devices, and the kind of not just professional but relational arrangement that this induces. So, learning to see. Staying in the medical realm for a while, I just want to give a couple of examples because there is insightful ethnographic work on how medical doctors are trained to see. For example, by Barry Saunders on diagnostic imaging and by Kenny Fountain on anatomy students learning from post-mortem sections. Saunders points out the narrative of intrigue and the language of beauty with which instructors orient their trainees in American teaching hospitals. He talks about social structures of pedagogy and how they are set by the standards of charismatic teachers in the CT reading room, inculcating rules of thumb and anecdotal testimony in social settings that are both peer-supported and competitive. My own acceptance of medical authority in how to read a scan is telling of how we are socially predisposed to accept authority and undergo flesh inculcations like the one by the liver surgeon. In a lifetime, we undergo much fewer, longer periods of enskillment. To learn to use one's senses, not just necessarily eyesight only, in a skilled way, enriches and defines us, just as much as learning a language or living in a specific place. Like identity, skilled vision is not monolithic. It depends on how many exposures each of us has had to relevant apprenticeships, professional, artistic, social. This is why I talk of skilled visions in the plural. Skilled visions are a form of tacit knowledge. Training, exercise, context, peer review, hierarchy, custom, and repetition all play a part in acquiring them and maintaining them. This is why vision is not per se a form of representation, but a complex relation between attention, habit, and representational capacities. I'll give some examples of ethnography of scientific practice because I think it gives us an idea of how the anthropology of vision can contribute an analytical but context-sensitive or context-relevant approach to what actually goes on when we use our eyes in competent ways in real-life settings. And these are usually social and multisensorial settings that also enroll a number of significant artifacts. Charles Goodwin is a linguistic anthropologist and has used techniques of discourse analysis to study what he calls professional vision among the police force, in airports, and in archaeology, among other settings. In this example that I reproduce, he observed the process of color identification in a chemistry lab. Goodwin here notes that a universal color semantics, which itself is not an object of dispute here, needs to be contextualized in order to function. In other words, a number of devices and mediations, including conversational mediation and multisensorial cues, are regularly used to make the connection that a color is indeed that color, and thus requires a set of consequent actions. For example, in this article, The Blackness of Black, an acrylic fiber is treated to measure radon in water. The chemical treatment is supposed to be terminated when that fiber turns jet black. And as you can see, if you read the transcript, a lot of hesitation and discursive negotiation happens around the vat to determine the blackness of black, including recurs to tactile metaphors. At some point, not here, they debate it should look like gorilla fur, not orangutan hair. So even within laboratory practice, maybe despite common sense expectations, the blackness of black is negotiated, debated, confirmed through a number of visualizing metaphors and conversational strategies. In my own ethnography of food activism, informants working in environmental pollution control tests also confirm that what we expect to be objective or standard measurements in scientific practice are down to a lot of subjective and contextual decisions. Firstly, of course, as noticed actually by the example before, there is the calibration of the instruments. Which, in the case of pollution control in water, have to be set up to look for certain molecules and not others. So one should know what one is looking for to start with. And secondly, there is the decision of the operator whether the spectrometer obtained from sampled water mimics the curve of the model pollutant. Such comparison is made at site. And one should consider that even when substituting this decision with a calibrated instrument that will make the comparison, say, automatically, then the subjectivity of judgment is simply delegated to the act of calibrating the instrument. So once again, once and for all, it becomes invisible again. I'll just stay with soil for a little bit, because it was looking again at soil that Bruno Latour revisited his actor network theory on the basis of empirical fieldwork, participant observation, with pedologists, namely soil analysts. In his book, Pandora's Hope, which goes back to 1999, he pinpoints the moment of transition from local measurements to transportable and movable data, which he calls immutable mobiles. In the color photographs, pedologists use Musso charts to determine the actual standard color of a sample of soil, and they hold the sample of soil under the chart to look at it through a peephole. This is how they make a transition, a reliable transition, from the color of that specific sample of soil to a universally coded color hue. The judgment is still made at site, but the transition is aided by juxtaposing the soil sample and the standard color card. Now, it's interesting that Charles Goodwin again focuses on exactly the same practice, exactly the same example, taken from an archaeological field instead of a pedology field, to highlight how specific routines of action and, once again, discursive interactions enable specific acts of looking, such as the one that we're documenting here. The idea of skilled vision owes a lot to this approach of investigating professional vision as a form of practical and contextual engagement. Goodwin points to the use of Munsell charts in the field and considers the very same act of juxtaposing soil and card as a proof that standards need to be made operational in a context through hands-on solutions such as making the peephole, tinkering of some sort, and recognized gestures, rules of thumbs, operational routines, so that this happens within a collectivity that knows what people are actually doing. So the skilled visions approach tries to generalize this finding and considers vision as a realm of social expertise that depends on trained perception within a structured environment. And to roughly define it, I propose 3 points. 1, looking is a technique of the body in the Mossian sense. This means that looking is culturally inculcated and socially performed. 2nd, learning how to look at the world is a complex form of apprenticeship. Learning how to decipher objects, events, and environments is a social and relational as well as a cognitive form of apprenticeship. And 3rd, any schooling of the eye results into a sensibility that it's developed and confirmed through repeated acts of looking. So as a result, different communities of practice, a notion introduced by an anthropologist, Jean Lave, here at UC Berkeley, different communities of practice engage differently with seeing and knowing. I have gathered examples from my own ethnography and from the work of other ethnographers of how visual apprenticeship takes place in different communities. And so you see here a number of really diverse images from the work of Francesco Ronzon on the social construction of beauty and grace in drag clubs, from the work of Andreas Rupsdorf on fMRI imaging at the Center for Functionally Integrative Neuroscience at Aarhus University in Denmark, and from my own fieldwork with the Italian American community in Boston and with food activist circles in the US and Italy. Now, as soon as one begins to ask people, what is it that makes one look like something? Or how do you recognize this as an instance of that? The definition of vision becomes unruly, evanescent, and contested. and inevitably mixes with personal experiences, specific practices, and stereotypes. I'll just give you a very brief example from a film of mine, Christmas in August, that I shot in Boston a couple of years ago, edited with Federico de Musso. This is Paul, the organizer of a religious festival called St. Anthony's Feast, and he talks about how you tell an Italian.
So I'll tell you the difference between an Italian, a real Italian, and someone who thinks they're Italian. A real Italian, when he dresses, okay, he gets up in the morning, puts on his clothes, and he looks in the mirror, and he says, okay, I look good. And he goes on his way. Someone who's not really Italian will dress and leave the house, thinking they look okay. That's the difference.
They don't check.
They don't check. If you go in any part of Italy, I don't care where you go, from the north to the south, to the east, to the west, on their worst day, an Italian always looks like he's going somewhere important, and he could be going nowhere. In America, unfortunately, it's not that way.
And it goes on for about half an hour. So this is just a teaser, really, to bring in this dimension too, that we think in vision as a daily practice of socially competent looking means situating visual knowledge in a complex social and historical setting that is shaped by history, acculturation, and self-stereotypes. So to place skilled visions at center stage of sensory epistemology was in 2007 when I started working on this. Quite a bold move, actually, because the recent scholarly rediscovery of the other senses had somewhat entailed a concomitant denigration of vision, to use a phrase of Martin Jay. Vision was equated to the Western gaze, domineering and perspectivalist by definition, suited to panopticon-like types of surveillance, cataloging other cultures in anachronistic ways. And sensory studies is now an expanding field, featuring recent volumes such as Sonic Persuasions, Past Sense, and A Cultural History of Touch. But ethnographic approaches to visuality still seem to be quite limited, as if it was some kind of a paradox and people couldn't quite grasp the idea. I first developed the concept of skilled visions with regard to my work as a visual anthropologist among dairy farmers in the northern Italian Alps. I was studying the educated capacity of breed inspectors and cattle fair judges to visualize the animal body in terms of functional beauty. Some visual anthropologists are filmmakers, some study visual cultures through textual means, some are practicing photographers, and for the purposes of this talk, I focus on visual ethnography, so namely observing people in their own practices of watching. Ethnographers have to develop bifocal lenses, so to speak, being aware both of their own apprenticeship of culturally competent ways of seeing and of other forms of apprenticeship. An anthropology of vision does not necessarily produce visual artifacts, but it includes an ethnographic analysis of the material settings, the institutional contexts, and the social actors involved in apprenticeships of the eye. So what ethnographers do is to study how this apprenticeship takes place in a complex, often idiosyncratic setting that is often not easy to generalize. People learn to perceive in ways that remain opaque to those who do not share the same apprenticeship. And ethnographers ask, how do people learn to decipher their professional, material, and social environments? And further, how do specific ways of looking harness perception to a sense of belonging? So now I would like to draw your attention to an image and ask how we can learn together to look at it in such a way that it becomes more meaningful. How we can unskill our vision so that we can place that image in a context. And the image is the color one that you can see. It's a picture I took during my fieldwork with dairy farmers in northern Italy at the foot of the Alps. The black and white images below come from a textbook that teach how to prepare a cow for a cattle fair. The animal is shaved and brushed, paraded at a peak curve of lactation and just before milking so that the udder is practically bursting with milk. The cow is literally made to pose for the cattle fair judge and for the camera. And we see here in the color photograph the ability of the farmer as he stops the walk of the cow practically midair to expose the udder ligament, the dorsal line, and the supple limbs. Criteria of bovine beauty are not abstract. In the trade, they respond to productivity requirements, which are called morphofunctional evaluations. Morphofunctional evaluations determine the desired shape of the animal, which traits should be selected, which angles the animal is viewed from, typically from behind, to evaluate the udder, and the so-called structural widths, which means aptitude to birth giving, etc. So this corpus of technical knowledge is codified in international standards. This is an international standard. And it directs and orients the look of breed experts. So what happens at cattle fairs is that judges simply look at the animals and rank them by lining them up in their order of preference. This rule holds across contexts, from the local fair of a remote mountain valley to the international fairs of the breeders of the Breed Association. I dealt mostly with farmers of the Brown Breed Association, and their relevant competitions take place in Switzerland, of course, Italy, France, Canada, and the US. Often similar routines hold across breeds and even species. Here on the left is an occasional visit to a horse breeding competition. The judge explains to the public which trait makes each animal superior to the one just following. This is a veritable lecture, an exercise in ranking that also confirms the authority of the breed expert and inculcates functional criteria in the audience of practitioners. Cattle fairs are spaces of intense staring. Animosity is hardly dissimulated, as competition is real and does not regard animal shapes only, but an entire worldview. For example, to brown breeders, Frisians look stupefied, brittle, deformed by excessive udders, and so on. Through a professional vision, to use Goodwin's expression, a moral tale is told, a tale of belonging. Visual apprenticeship does not deal with the eye alone, but also with a concurrent multisensorial enskillment. Even though the judge only looks, he is ready to touch if he feels that something is amiss. An udder swollen with mastitis, for instance, would feel hot at the touch. Some farmers boast that they not only know each of their cows by name, of course, but they can tell how they feel by the way they return their looks. So this sensibility endorses and in fact generates pleasurable or indeed displeasing experiences when a farmer casts a knowledgeable look onto the objects of their expertise. A good-looking cow is a pleasure for the eyes. But what is a good-looking cow? In the circle of progeny breeding, cattle that is not improved, namely crossbred with progeny bulls, elicits a gut-feeling reaction, not only of aesthetic repugnance, but outright moral disapproval of their breeders. And the other way round. High-yield cows are dismissed as anorexic pin-ups by the critics of functional breed selection, which is turning cattle into milk machines. So aesthetic apprenticeship shapes and articulates an entire ecology of belonging. And by this expression, I mean the environment, both social and material, that allows, encourages, and confirms belonging to a specific community of lookers. These are people who will share, often tacitly, certain techniques, standards, and gestures, ways of looking. where do these ways of looking come from? Well, in this particular case, since the tradition of animal portraiture was established in the England of the Agricultural Revolution, the representation of bovine shapes has followed and documented a normalization of breeding aesthetics geared toward functional bodies. Models like these render our perceptual expectations adequate to prescribed standards of practice. On the other hand, reality itself, and in this case animal shapes, is ordered, improved, and ranked according to those expectations. This is, of course, not just a professional vision, but a moral vision, which performs hegemonic expectations about what animals are for milk or meat, for example, and what they should look like. Even plastic toys incorporate the breeder's expectations about the animal body. This is a little joke I did. I took a plastic toy cow and I tried to apply the breeder's gaze, applying the linear module for morphofunctional evaluation. You can see that this cow has no horns, has huge udders, and symmetrically placed teats. These are just as good for machine milking, of course, as they are for plastic casting in miniature shapes. So there is some convergence of industrial productive interests here. But what is interesting is that there's no reason why a plastic toy should look like that. And it looks exactly the way that it's supposed to be if it was a milking cow. So I've 3 minutes, so I will spend too much time to try and make you appreciate, I don't know, the how linear the dorsal line is, how thin the animal is, how clean the bones are. This is obviously a hyperthyroidic animal whose metabolism is completely geared toward milk making. The bones, especially the hip bones, are nicely clear of flesh, and that's not what a meat cow would look like. Okay, and of course, the symmetrically placed teats are not a matter just of aesthetics, but of functionality. They need to work in milking machines without getting damaged, and therefore develop mastitis, and so that the animal gets taken out of production. But to conclude, this and other examples, I hope, show how looking is a culturally situated capacity which is learned, embodied, and socialized in specific ways for distinct taskscapes, another expression of anthropologists Tim Ingold. Each task defines a community of viewers that receive a sensorial and cultural apprenticeship through intense practices of narration, evaluation, and standard setting, which involves experts, peers, and novices. We see in certain ways, not only due to the universal psychological wiring, which we share, obviously, but also according to how we have learned to look at the world. To study skilled visions in a social anthropological way is therefore quite different from seeking to apply or define universal modes of perception. Looking is not just perception, but a form of cultural orientation in the world. There are social rules, often tacit rules, of interocularity, to borrow an expression of Christopher Pinney, that require to position oneself, to define and articulate what is being seen in heavily prescribed ways. Thank you.
The question is the original state at which different people have the ability to see in context. I want to mention a game that children like to play called Escape from Rosecliff Island. It's a matter of hiding in plain sight. You get a screen, and there are 50 objects you're supposed to identify, put the cursor on, and make them disappear. And what I found fascinating among my grandchildren was their respective starting abilities or disabilities in this where they'd never been exposed to it, right? Where one might somehow intuit where these objects were, and the other would struggle. Right? I'm saying that in order to try to combine the two presentations. You speak of learned skill of seeing, but there must be a starting baseline.
Sure, I'm not contesting that, and it's not the object of my investigation. It's a bit, so the original state, I could equate it to the definition of the minimum condition under which. I am interested in the maximal condition, if you want, the other way around. As a social anthropologist, I do not set up experiments. I take the world as it is. And the world is an extremely complicated but fascinating place. And it's made of collectives. It's made of communities and histories. I guess the relevance of this kind of approach to the research interests that bring us all here today is probably the sensitivity to one fundamental question. And the question would be, to whom are our standards relevant? Whom do they represent? Which population? Are we naturalizing certain sampling of experimental populations that basically mirror our own condition? When there are several types of conditions. So it may be premature, and it may be an unproductive question at this stage, but I think it would become so much more relevant if neuroesthetic and results from cognitive vision spoke to specific populations in terms of gender, age, ethnicity. But what really interests me is apprenticeship, is communities of practice. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
See if I can form it. I really related to my own life about certain practices and making those distinctions. And I was really interested in when you mentioned how some people would experience like almost a disgust for something that wasn't in the standard that they were trained to look for as beautiful. And I was wondering if you mentioned it in relation to the functional needs of the situation, but did you see those being formed in a very like organic way, some natural aesthetic of beauty or some like functional use, or are you also talking about just like bias or preference that comes from, I guess like, do you see what I'm saying? And is that innate? Like, do you think that was innate in all those practices, or it had to be there?
No, I don't believe it's innate, because the level at which I'm talking about gut feeling is a very culturally elaborate level. Then again, it really depends what we mean by innate. It's ingrained, it's embodied, it's with some people from their very birth, but not because it's innate, because it's learned within their families, because children play with these plastic toy cows, and they get a very precise idea of what a cow must look like to be beautiful, for example. And how can I say, this is not purely speculative. It really makes a difference to people to have a precise sense of what is beautiful and what is right. and what is good when it's time to make decisions. And to make, for example, decisions on how to change the food system, which is something that I work on when I do ethnography with food activists, is not just a rational decision to decide whether a cow should be a high-yielding cow or a multifunctional cow that is probably half the size, it's half, and produces half milk, is not just a decision on cost and benefits. It's also a gut-feeling decision. So people that have been farming all their life and have been told for decades and even generations what good-looking animals are like, they will not be prepared to revert their convictions and change their farming practice. They have some standards about what an improved animal will look like, and these standards have been inculcated since the 1700s. So there is some cultural work to be done there. And I do think it's cultural work. I don't think it's, beyond certain levels, I don't think that there is too much innate of an aesthetic inventory. So much can be learned and manipulated over time. Yes?
Thanks very much. I was very pleased to hear you mention Tim Ingold and his very important work in these areas. And I noticed that you spent most of your time speaking about a mode of skilled vision which separates vision from any other kind of sensory or multimodal practice, whereas the example in the chemistry lab involved the kind of calibration of vision with other kinds of bodily practices like texture, feeling texture. So why, when you talk about skilled vision, or could you distinguish between the kind of skilled vision of the sort of contemplative, distanced visual judgment of the cow judge, as opposed to the kind of skilled vision which is involved in a kind of multimodal sensorimotor practice, as you say, of a kind of apprenticeship?
Okay, I think all kinds of apprenticeship are multisensorial, but I am interested in vision because it is one of the dominant senses in our culture, and I think we should know more about it and how it works in real-life settings, considering the history we have and the communities of practice that we have. Actually, the other examples are just as contemplative in the sense that vision is the sense that is mostly engaged. When they talk about texture, it's visual metaphors of texture. These people are not grabbing stuff in the vat. But this is because I choose examples that examples of predominantly visual activities. I do not think that any of these activities could be described as contemplative. They're not. They're all hands-on, they're all engaged, and they all are multisensorial. But obviously, I'm not doing a cultural history of touch, or I'm not talking about soundscapes. I am truly interested in learning how people use their eyes. And there is a reason, a historical reason, why we're all here talking about seeing and knowing. So I just think that it would be fair to the topic to consider cultural histories of seeing and knowing from an ethnographic point of view, even though it complexifies the object in sometimes impossible ways. Yeah, 2 people. You tell me when to stop.
I was wondering if it would be fair to say that it's a normative process, or you're trying to look for an optimal, you're building a a bell curve when you're doing this kind of apprenticeship, where you're finding what is the optimal point, what is the normative point, whether is beauty or function or diseased organ. So you have to see a lot of normals, a lot of abnormals, a lot of shades of gray before you can decide what is the optimal cow or the healthy eye or the body part or brain scan. But you have to see a lot of range before you can have success in that apprenticeship. It's like building of a bell curve.
I would agree with the description you've just given. Exposure to a variety of examples under an authoritative guidance that explains where to place each example within a range.
Right.
Did I make sense of your?
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. Is that the last one?
I have one more.
Excellent. Yeah, these two. Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I wanted to ask you what you found or what you think about the extent to which people who are in these apprenticeships, who have been brought up in the apprenticeship or are highly trained in this kind of seeing, for example, with the milk cattle, they retain the knowledge of what they're looking at. Can they communicate? Well, at the fair, I suppose, there are points that everyone knows about. But as someone becomes more visually skilled, do they also, I have the sense that they might lose the ability to communicate what they're seeing to someone else as it becomes more and more ingrained and they're more and more enculturated in that community of looking. And I wonder what you found about that.
Yes, like in any community of practice, some people are more gifted in articulating their own embodied, ingrained, and tacit knowledge. But it is true that, especially within a community that shares the same expertise and skill, a lot of that knowledge becomes tacit. And there is some sense of sharing, some sense of belonging in being able to cast a knowledgeable eye on whatever object. It can be a cow, knowing that you're looking at that cow in exactly the same way that as the person sitting next to you, whereas other person are blind to that. So there is a certain kind of reveling into the tacitness. There is a lot of work of elicitation that must be done, and the best way is to undergo an apprenticeship.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.